start the recording. And we are now recording. So this is Matt Menifee with Forensic Science at University High School, and I'm here with Jim Davis again. Jim, go ahead and give us a little bit of your background, and then we'll get started.
Hi, I'm Jim Davis. I work for the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections from 1990 until 2018, so close to 29 years. I was an officer for 17 years, corrections officer, served on emergency response teams, fire emergency response team. I was a sniper for several years on the response team. And an instructor for staff and for inmates. I became a corrections counselor in 2006, I believe it was, and finished out my career in that. So I used to give cognitive behavioral programs to inmates and also run a caseload. So I had both sides. I had security and the treatment side of the prison system. I worked at SCI Graterford for. I started my career there, then I transferred to a community corrections center for 7 years, then I transferred back to Graterford. It closed down in 2017. So I worked at SCI Phoenix, which was a new prison, for 1 year, and then I retired.
And so your total time experience in the prison is roughly how many years?
Just under 29.
Just under 29 years. So lots of experience in pretty much every aspect of the security side, correction side of the prison system.
Yeah, security always came first. Even when you were in treatment, security was paramount first and foremost.
Okay, so let me go and tell you, my students, they really enjoyed the last set of interviews we did with you greatly. They definitely enjoyed the stories, and they were definitely creeped out about the gentleman who, took fell out of his anus, because just freaking weird. So let's go ahead and start with let's start with an early case or an early scenario. Would you be willing to tell us the first time that you dealt with prisoner on prisoner violence?
Yeah, it was it's kind of a double-edged question. The first really freaky thing I saw was I was there, I believe it was during the first week. It was called shift observation. They just assigned you to a cell block with a crew and said, watch and learn. So I didn't even have a set of keys yet to open doors. And I saw an inmate running down the top tier of the cell block, being chased by a herd of officers. And it was streaming, blood was pouring from his groin because he had lopped off his testicles.
He what?
He cut his testicles off, and then decided to run down the cell block like that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I said too. And so I was I was in just utter shock. I mean, it was like, oh my God, what do I do? And the first thing I said is, I'm not chasing that freaking guy. I'm not getting involved in that. The hell with that. So I guess they got him and got him down to medical, but he was obviously suffering from mental health issues. And I did see a second case where an individual did that. Actually, I saw the aftermath. It was the cell. I looked in the cell, and the blood was pooled up. It was like, it looked like pudding, and the family jewels were in the middle of that pile of pudding. So that was my first. It wasn't inmate on inmate violence. It was just the first insane thing that I saw. The first stabbing that happened, I started October 15th in the prison, and just before Thanksgiving, I was escorting an inmate from the cell block back to the main kitchen. There was a corridor that connected the main kitchen of the prison to all the cell blocks on the old side. And I started escorting this guy. He was pushing, we called them truck runners. He was pushing a cart up to the kitchen because they would fill these stainless steel pans with more food. It was the breakfast meal, so it was probably like oatmeal or grits or something that they'd fill these up, and then we'd bring them back to the block and serve them in the block kitchen. So the inmates didn't have to leave the cell block to eat a meal. It was kind of contained. We had A through E blocks, so there was 5 blocks.
And so I'm guessing this was to really minimize movement of inmates in an area.
Yes. So this inmate kitchen worker, the truck runner, I'm escorting him up, and I didn't look behind me, which I should have. We just kind of rolled out, took a right turn, and we're heading up the block. It's like 6:20 in the morning. I'm tired. I'm just, it's a cold fall morning. You're miserable. You got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and you're like, oh, screw this. This sucks. And from behind me, another inmate ran up, and
Can we pause it, Jim? Okay.
all right. So this guy, very, very large inmate, the size of an NFL linebacker. His arms were bigger than my legs. He was armed with a knife. The knife blade was probably, I would say, exceeded 10 inches, probably 10 to 12 inches. It was a homemade ice. I'm sorry. Oh, they make them. They make them, and I'll get into that in a little bit. We can definitely expound on that.
Okay.
He runs up and he's holding it in an ice pick grip like this, and I just heard him say to the guy that was pushing the truck didn't see him coming up, and all I heard him say was, "This is it, motherfucker!" And bang, 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 bang. He stabbed him 4 times in the back. The knife blade penetrated both of his shoulder blades. It hit his lungs, and it actually nicked the inmate's heart. The inmate who got stabbed didn't realize he'd been stabbed. He felt no pain. And it was just the first stab that he did. I didn't see the blade. I heard like a meaty, like he punched him. And for a millisecond, I was thinking, man, I wish these guys would stop messing around like this, because inmates are always horseplaying, punching each other, and just screwing around.
Yeah.
For a split second, I thought that's what was happening. But then I saw, as he withdrew the blade came out of his back and then went in several more times.
And how, and roughly in a time span, was this like 5 seconds or less?
Oh, I would say 3 to 5 max. It happened so quickly. The blade went past my head into the man's back, because I was standing maybe, I'd say, 1 to 2 feet away from the inmate who was being stabbed. So it literally went past my head into the guy's back.
So the inmate was not you, he was going after the other inmate.
Correct.
Okay.
If he wanted me, he would have had me. I would have never seen it coming.
Okay. All right. And so the guy's been stabbed. You can see the blood. What's the next step?
Actually, I didn't see any blood initially. I cannot remember recalling it. I can't see any blood from start to finish. All of his injuries were internal, and that's what you get with here's a shank. This is an example. This is broken off of the handle of a 5-gallon bucket, the plastic buckets that you see everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You could make 3 to 5 shanks. You break the handle off a bucket, take it back. You just bend it until it breaks, and then with this one, I folded it over into a U shape, and then I added the touch of I put the plastic handle part. I just slipped it over. Typically, they'll do that, or they'll tape it up. They'll wrap it with a whole lot of tape, and here you have a weapon. You can't slash with it, but who cares? It will poke the living hell out of you, and that's about a 5-inch blade right there. Yeah. That's going to cause internal bleeding. You're not going to see much blood on the outside for a little bit. It's all internal. Yeah. So this is approximately what he used, but it was about twice as long, and it was thicker. It wasn't this thin gauge, metal. But just a simple 5-gallon bucket. If you're not careful and it gets into the inmate's hands, you can get about 3 of these out of that. Wow. So that's one place where inmates get weapons. security is inconvenient, and people do not like to be inconvenienced. And that's a basic tenet of whether you're trying to infiltrate a place, and you bear that in mind. People don't like to be inconvenienced, or whether you're working at a place trying to prevent stuff from happening. Also keep that in mind, because people will cut corners. They won't pay attention to detail, and that causes security lapses.
Yeah. And
So
people are tired, people are sleepy, people have had a rough day.
yeah,
You know, what we always talk about is we talk about for a lot of cyber crimes, there's a lot of social engineering, which is, hey, I'm distracted by this. And because I'm distracted by this, you know, or you're hitting enough keys for me to give the information away, and that information lets you get into my system. And so that same basic idea applied to a violent crime as well. You're, hey,
absolutely.
Something is distracting me. I'm preoccupied with something. I'm looking at this inmate causing an issue over here. And because of that, I'm not paying attention to this inmate that's over here.
And they will orchestrate that. They'll set things up. They'll get with each other and say, hey, get their attention. Meanwhile, I'm going to go do this, whether it's smuggling drugs or whacking somebody.
Wow.
They're team players. You know, when they want something, they will figure out a way to make it happen, and they'll do it.
Okay.
So this guy gets whacked 4 times. That's what we call it: stabbing, shanking, getting whacked. So he was stabbed, and he didn't know it. He thought he got punched in the back. So he grabs, and I guess he saw the knife then. So he grabbed the tray that was covering the pan, like the pan lid. So he was holding it up like a shield while the guy was still trying to stab him. So that was his shield. During this whole thing, I was basically alone. There was one other guy, a captain back there. He ran up and tackled the inmate that had gotten stabbed. Meanwhile, I'm trying to tell him, sir, that's not the guy, you know, but it was getting crazy. So all I was armed with was a whistle. We were issued whistles. 3 blasts on the whistle meant, come and help me, I need help.
Yeah.
So I was blowing that like it was my best friend. That didn't sound very good. So by that time, one of my coworkers stuck his head out from the cell block kitchen, saw what was happening. I saw his head dart back in the kitchen, the door slammed and locked. So he locked me out there alone. Yeah, good friend.
Now, at this time, had y'all been had stab-resistant vests become commonplace in the prison system yet?
No, we didn't even have cameras at that point.
Wow. Okay, so
no vests, no cameras.
So this is early 90s, mid 90s?
This is 1990, November. So now all this, it's taken way longer to explain it than it actually took. Start to finish was about a minute until we resolved it. People heard me blowing the whistle, so they started coming. And by this time, the guy was holding me, holding the knife up at me. He was starting to come at me with the knife. So all he said was, I told him, drop the knife. He said, get the fuck away from me. And as the state police interviewed me later on, they said, well, what did you do with that at that point? I said, I got the fuck away from him.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, that was probably good. I saw this guy, I'm jumping around here. I saw this inmate in the restricted housing unit a couple weeks later because I was working down there. And I asked him, I said, would you have stabbed me? He goes, yeah, if you'd have come near me, yeah, you were getting stabbed too. So basically, the troops are coming down the hallway. He's coming at me with the knife, and I'm kind of angling away, getting off the X, as we call it. And you heard the thundering, crowd coming down, the footsteps thundering in the hallway, echoing. And so he turns around at them with the knife, and he just announces, "Come on, motherfuckers, we're gonna get it on."
Wow!
Everybody stopped. Now, don't forget, this guy's massive. His nickname is Mean Machine. So we basically kind of surrounded him in a semicircle. He backed himself against the wall. And he said, when I go to the hole, I want my TV and my radio, which never happened. When you go to the hole, you never get your TV and radio back in those days.
Okay, Jim, I'm going to have to pause this real quick.
Okay.
because I have students coming to the door and I need to let them in. So I'm going
Okay.
to pause this. Let me find my pause button here. Yeah, yeah, whatever. Okay.
That's cool.
So let's go. I got the recordings back going on. So let's go ahead. The guys in the hole. So what happened to the individual who was stabbed? Did he pass away? Did he make it?
He survived. Amazingly, he survived. Yeah. And he was there for years to come. I forget where I was kind of going. Yeah, we basically surrounded him. He wanted his radio and TV in the hole, and at that point we are like, oh yeah, yeah. Is there anything else you want? Because big man with knife. Nobody was going to dive in there. It is not like the movies where you launch a few kicks and kick him upside the head and he drops the knife and you handcuff him. It doesn't work that way. So anytime you can peacefully negotiate, especially when you're unarmed, because we're totally unarmed in there. People in the towers had rifles and stuff, but in the inside of the prison, aren't armed with anything. So we eventually negotiated that away, and he was charged by the state police. And oddly enough, as I was working in Wernersville at the Community Corrections Center several years back, I walked down the hallway and I looked at this guy and I'm like, I know this guy from somewhere. Then it dawned on me, it was the stabber. He had been let out of prison on parole and was at this halfway house where I was working. So we just kind of looked at each other and I'm like, what's up? And he's like, oh, I said, all right, well, whatever. Just kind of keeping an eye on this dude because I'm like, all right. So I went to my supervisor. I said, look, he's got to go. And they usually don't like to transfer inmates. My supervisor was kind of like, well, I said, well, let me put it in terms you can understand, and you're going to get this in writing as well. I have PTSD from this incident, and I'm going to assume if he sneezes wrong, breathes wrong, brushes a fly off of his shoulder, that he's going to attack me. And I said, you're going to be responsible for what happens after that. I said, because I'm not messing around.
Yeah.
So I submitted an incident report detailing what happened and everything, and they did transfer him to a center about 50 miles away, and then he promptly absconded, which means he left without approval and is God knows where he's at now. I have no idea.
Yeah.
So I've seen so many stabbings that I literally can't remember them all.
Okay, so let's kind of narrow down the field. When an inmate was stabbed, was it usually from behind, from the front? Did it make any difference?
Generally, it was behind, and it was an ambush attack. It happened very similar to on the street. Typically, you're either going to get two people in an argument. F you, no F you, no F you more, and then somebody produces a weapon and they go at it. Typically, when somebody decides you're not going to get to live anymore, they come from behind.
Okay, an ice pick grip, for my students who are not familiar, it's literally kind of you take it and it's going down. It's a downward striking, as I try to get myself on camera. Downward striking. And so I'm guessing it would be in the back, the neck, the shoulders, somewhere. Generally like that.
The head, neck, face. This is a shank that I made. It's just a toothbrush handle. You break the head off the toothbrush. How do you sharpen it? Well, the state has provided you with a cell with a concrete floor and walls. Concrete sharpens plastic, sharpens metal. I did this one on the concrete steps outside of my house. It took me about 3 minutes to get a deadly tip on this thing. So it
We learned, I think I learned it from Ed Calderon, the crystal pin bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Sharpen them to a razor edge on industrial carpeting. So any sort of quote unquote industrial, like nylon based carpeting or polyester carpeting, it's got enough abrasion to it that'll catch this, and you can basically put a razor edge on a crystal pin.
Okay, you mean on the tip or the edge?
Like you'd have to pull the pin out, and so
Okay.
uh,
Oh, you don't have to go through all that.
so yeah, so it basically you're making a razor edge hypodermic syringe tip on the edge of it.
Okay. So yeah, where the and, there's I have that article that I sent you on improvised weapons that covers a lot of stuff. And I also sent you an article on knife attacks.
Yeah, and
I had
my
uh,
students are both going to be reading those before they send this see this.
okay. The second one, the knife attack article is pretty gory, but it shouldn't be that bad because you guys have been covering. Um,
Yeah,
so basically,
at this point, they're pretty used to it.
okay, there there's so many things to make weapons out of. And remember, I said security is inconvenient. Well, people would sometimes work crews would leave things lay around. Lexan and plexiglass were big things. The inmates would get a hold of that, and it's non-metallic, so they'd sharpen it up, and you had a shank that would go through metal detectors without being detected. And it's very, very strong. I mean, you can kill with a piece of Lexan, you can kill somebody. Um, Typically, oh, go ahead.
So I'm guessing most of the wounds you saw were more stabbing wounds than slashing wounds, as a general rule.
Uh, Most were stabs. There were some slashes, like with this toothbrush handle. Sometimes they would melt it and get it soft and pliable. They break apart their razors, just a regular Bic safety razor, get the razor blades out, and then they would embed them along the handle here, and you basically had a slicing a razor knife, like a straight razor.
So basically, modern world version of the old Aztec war sword, which was essentially flakes of obsidian embedded into a wooden, essentially baseball bat item from
Yeah,
1,000 years ago. And so,
yeah,
like,
just
hey,
on a smaller.
yeah, just a lot
Yeah,
smaller and not having a continuous edge.
correct.
It's gonna break, but whatever, it gets the job done.
Right, and anybody can get a toothbrush because we're not going to keep those for people. So I've never seen anybody die from slash wounds. Not to say it doesn't happen. I've just never seen it, and I've seen a lot. All the fatalities I saw were from stab wounds. It gets in there, it causes internal bleeding, and you can't. All you can do is pack the wound. That's the most you're going to do. You need to go to a doctor or hospital to get that. With a slash, you can pack it, you can stop the bleeding, you can do a number of things. But with a puncture wound, especially with these ice pick type things, that really gets in there, and it leaves you nothing to work with because the entry wound is so tiny.
I mean, you really have to incise the wound to pack it because you've got such a small wound channel opening.
Yeah, a surgeon would have to open it up and go in there and treat it.
Now,
So
now I've heard this before, and I don't know if this is true, so I'll ask you. I've heard that it's easier to treat certain types of gunshot wounds than it is for something like an ice pick wound, just for the simple fact that gunshot wound has a larger amount of opening into the wound cavity wound area. What do you say about that?
I would say there's probably some truth to that. A gunshot, yeah, it's going to open it up. You're going to get a permanent stretch cavity, a crush cavity. With rifle wounds, no. What rifle wounds are gonna you're gonna tear stuff apart inside. There's going to be bullet fragments. With pistol wounds, I think I'd rather get shot with a 22 than stabbed with one of these things.
Yeah,
It's just nasty. Yeah, I saw a number of people die. One of the worst ones was a guy. He was messing with this younger inmate. He kept blowing him kisses and rubbing up against him and stuff in the prison clothing shop. I worked right across the hallway from the clothing shops. My main job for over 10 years was guarding a cell block door. Anybody that passed on or off the cell block had to come through me. They had to have authorization to come on or off. So I'm standing there, and this little, I call him a little kid. He was a young inmate. Got a clothing shears that was about 10 inches long, and this big dude came after him, and he just started. The big guy grabbed him in a bear hug, and this kid's just pounding away with his clothing shears into his guts, and opened him up. You know, his intestines were hanging out and stuff, and the larger inmate kept going after him. He wouldn't stop. He just kept. He'd fall down and he'd get back up and he'd go after him, and bang, he'd get stabbed some more.
I'm
And
guessing the larger inmate passed away.
he did. They brought him out of the shop and they put him on. It was just a utility cart because it took forever for dispensary people to come when you called them. They just didn't want to come out of the dispensary, the nurses and whatnot. So they were gonna run him down to the dispensary on the cart, use it as kind of a portable ambulance, and he kept trying to get up. They were like, "Stay down, you're," and then he just passed away right there.
Wow.
I heard on the radio they had called for a medevac helicopter, and a couple minutes later, I had heard on the radio they said, "Cancel the chopper, we don't need it."
So
But he died in the hallway.
okay, so just because for clarification's sake, so when you have an inmate pass away like that under a violent attack, do they have to run an autopsy on that victim?
I'm not certain what happens. Typically, you lock the entire area down, put up police tape, the state police or whoever's going to investigate comes in and does an investigation.
So
It's a crime scene.
So it is a crime scene. It's a secured crime scene. You're going to have
Yes.
state police come in because they're the separate agency or they're the
Yes.
outside agency, and so they'll come in. They'll do the investigation for the death, cause of death, all that stuff. Okay.
Yeah, internal security in the DOC would also do their investigation. But yeah, you brought in you basically cross investigated it with another agency. That yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So I'm guessing inmates, weapons, not hard to come by.
Oh, very very easy to come by.
Okay. So was there, say, because we're always kind of curious about this, and I know my students would ask this. So if an inmate made a weapon, how much could they, quote unquote, sell that weapon for to another inmate? Would it be a couple packs of ramen, a couple packs of cigarettes, stamps?
Typically, a couple packs of cigarettes, depending on the elaborate nature. One of the best I ever saw was an inmate. We had a small engine repair shop inside the wall years ago, so they would bring in lawnmowers and things from the prison grounds, and they would service them and whatever. He got the idea. He took off the lawnmower blade from a lawnmower, and he took it to a grinder and he ground it down, and he made himself a machete. That was like, you know how thick a lawnmower blade is. It's like
That's about a quarter inch thick.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Yeah,
thick.
he made a machete, and it was a lawnmower blade long, and taped up the handle very. It was a wonderful weapon as far as prison stuff goes. Fortunately, it didn't get used on anybody that I saw because it could have lopped off an arm or maybe a head.
Got confiscated, I'm guessing, pretty quickly.
That was about the most ridiculous thing I ever saw weapon-wise. Typically, simple shanks like I showed you here. I mean, they would get very ingenious in hiding them. I mean, they could hide them in the leg of their table in their cell or whatever. Typically, a lock and a sock was the most prevalent and simplest. Everybody's got socks. The inmates had locks for their cell doors and for their foot lockers in their cell, and they were padlocks, combination locks. You just drop it into a sock or a pillowcase, and man, you've got a wicked weapon.
So did you see very many attacks with the sock in the pillowcase? I'm sorry, not the sock in the pillowcase, the lock in the pillowcase, the lock in the sock, or the bar of soap in the sock, which I've seen in in mobster movies, and like the orange in the sock kind of thing.
Only about every 2 to 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah, when I started there from 1990 until 95, there was a stabbing every shift or an attack every shift, basically. And if there wasn't, you were like, oh crap, what are they saving up for? Because they seem to make up for it the following shift.
So no one can have this shift. We're going to get 5 next shift.
Yeah, basically, it's like, oh, we're behind quota here. We have to. Yeah, it was a bloodbath every day.
So how often? Okay, so we know stabbings could definitely result, or I'm sorry, a stabbing with penetration, however you want to describe it, could definitely
Yeah,
result in that because you can hit internal organs, parts, stuff like that. Person can
yeah,
bleed out internally and not even know that they're bleeding out.
yeah,
Okay. How often did you see, you said the sock, or I'm sorry, the sock weapon, improvised, sock weapon.
yeah.
Did that really result in very many deaths, or was that mostly contusion, breaks, injury?
Usually contusion. Yeah, I don't know that I ever saw anybody killed in that manner.
Yeah.
It was usually with shanks, with knives.
So,
Um,
so it might be there to make an impression or to make a statement as opposed to actually finish somebody off.
yeah, I mean, not that they didn't try to kill each other with that sometimes, because good golly, I mean, some of the ones I saw, I was like, holy crap.
Yeah.
Um, but it's harder to bludgeon someone to death than stab them. One inmate I saw, he had gotten stabbed. I was in a control center for the news site on my lunch break, visiting one of my officer buddies, and they brought this guy through on a stretcher, and he had been stabbed in the neck and shoulders a lot, but he also had a stab wound in the center of his forehead, and it was just a black hole. It looked like he had been shot there, and he appeared to be dead when they brought him through. The staring eyes and whatever at the ceiling. So I was like, wow, maybe I better get back out there and see what's going on. So I followed the blood trail down the hallway and to B block, and I followed it down to the cell where it happened, and then up to the bridge of the block where the guy staggered to and collapsed. So much blood, it was unbelievable. It looked like somebody turned a garden hose on and just walked along with it, but instead of water, it was blood.
That's
And
yeah.
the body holds a lot of blood.
Yeah, and we've talked about it that really that 2 to 3 liter amount, when you lose
Yeah,
that amount, you're pretty much dead because there's not enough blood pressure left in the body, and you're going to
yeah,
need at the very least a saline transfusion, and at the most a whole blood transfusion if you're going to survive that. On
yeah.
top
Your
of
birth
that,
certificate, your birth certificate probably will expire if that happens.
so yeah, so if he's bleeding like a hose, and I don't mean to get into the gory details here, but we've always talked about the arterial spurt, which is you hit one of the major artery areas, neck,
Yeah,
underarms, under between the thigh, um, and it kind of spurts out, and where you'll see like there's a little, and then there's a lot, little
yeah.
lot, little lot. Would you? I mean, and I hate to bring up old case details like this. Would you say that's
Yeah.
kind of how you saw it, or was it more of a consistent line?
It was more of a consistent line from what I recollect. I did see one guy with his jugular vein cut, and it was spurting across the 15-yard wide hallway, as you described. It was spurting
Wow.
across. One of the lieutenants grabbed a towel and put it on the guy's neck, and the guy actually survived.
Yeah,
He had been bench pressing out in the yard, and somebody came up with a pillowcase, threw a pillowcase over his head, and they sliced his neck open.
and they just weren't super accurate in where they were going.
No, they were pretty accurate. They got his jugular. I
But
mean, it was
survived.
spiced, but somehow they saved the guy's life. Yeah, just astounding.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
was there any? Okay, so now we've talked about inflicted violence. So someone has gone after someone on purpose. Did you see accidental deaths where someone just did something that just I did something dumb or something happened? It was just accidental. That was not a violent death per se. Because I know we've talked about in the past with
yeah,
the setting up the electrical lighters or putting two wires into the outlet
yeah.
for them to, I believe it was light cigarettes or
It was
light,
stinger, yeah.
yeah,
To
light
heat you
spice or
for
something.
water.
Um,
Not not
any,
really. Most of the ones I saw, a lot of mental health guys who would run headfirst into the wall trying to kill themselves. Sometimes would succeed. A couple times, guys jumped off the tier headfirst into the concrete below.
but that would be more suicidal and not accidental.
Yeah, I don't know that I ever saw an accidental. The closest one was a work crew working on the roof, and a guy fell through a skylight accidentally and landed, on in a control room. But not really accidental. The most bizarre suicide I saw was where a guy he got several butane lighters and hooked them up and had it running into. He put a plastic bag over his head, like a garbage bag,
Yeah,
and had the butane running up there and killed himself that way.
through
Uh,
through butane inhalation.
yes,
Okay, and just
that
for
was
my
about.
yeah, just for my students' clarity, guys, butane is the stuff you'd have in lighters. It is explosive, but it's also a heavy gas, heavier liquid, and so it's going to once you breathe it in, it's going to sit in the base of the lungs, and you can't really extract it unless you invert the body or unless you have some sort of tool to extract the substance from the body, because it'll block the alveoli in there and the lungs won't function properly. So what did you see, and I, like I said, this is really about injuries and stuff. Did you see anything where it was like pink, frothy blood from like a stab wound to the chest or a stab wound to the throat or face, where you saw a heavy oxygenated blood at any point? Or like slightly bubbly, kind of a brighter color pink or brighter color?
Yeah, a couple times. Yeah, depending on where people would get stabbed. Yeah, one of the um, one of the last ones I responded to, one inmate. This was in a new prison. Not really related to that, but the blood splatter in this was just so phenomenal. One inmate attacked another. He had broken off a mop handle and the sharp end like a spear.
Yeah.
It was like a 4-foot spear. He'd stabbed him in the head with it, and they started rolling around, wrestling on the ground, and it was the size. I mean, the blood splatter was like in a probably 50-foot by 50-foot area, maybe even more. It was the floor of the entire cell block, and the cell blocks in a new prison are very, very open. I can send you photos then.
Yeah, please do.
I just, I mean, I couldn't take any photos of the blood
No,
splatter.
no. The cell block, the framework.
Yeah. And it was just everywhere. It looked like somebody dipped a paintbrush into a red bucket of paint. It was just splattering paint everywhere, but it was blood. Just phenomenal. And we came in, and the guy that got stabbed, by the time I got there, the sergeant was applying a towel to his head to stop the bleeding, and I think he wound up with like 8 stitches in his head.
But
It looked like,
blood everywhere.
yeah, it looked like he got shot with a 12 gauge. It was ridiculous. But head wounds bleed a whole lot, and this was just as far as blood coverage, this was one of the biggest ones that I ever saw in my life. I was like, wow.
Yeah, and for my students, here's the thing. Cuts through here in the head, there's a lot of capillaries through there. So your smaller veins or smaller arteries are going to be through there. So if they're cut, it's going to bleed a lot. Same thing with the hands, right through here. Those cuts are going to bleed a lot as well because of the intense amount of capillaries. So your foot, top of your foot, same things. Any place where there's a large collection of capillaries or where you've got a lot of digits going on, you're going to see a lot of blood. Face, ears, stuff like that. It's going to be a lot of blood.
One interesting aspect too that over the years, in certain areas of the prison, like reception, where guys are coming in, you have to strip search them a lot. And what we find a lot, almost every inmate had scars, whether it was knife wounds, gunshot wounds. So I started asking them, what'd you get shot with? Oh, it was a 22. It was a 38, whatever. What happened when you got shot? What were you doing? Well, I was robbing this guy. Oh, well, we were in a shootout. Oh, okay. Well, when you got shot, were you able to keep shooting? Oh, yeah. And I'd start asking, well, did it hurt? Well, not really. The majority of traumatic wounds don't hurt immediately because you're under adrenaline. It kills the pain.
Yeah.
So the majority of people that were shot kept doing what they were doing at the time. The movie fallacy of, you get shot, you fall down and die, generally does not happen. You might you might die an hour later or days later, but that doesn't help you during the shootout.
Yeah.
So the majority of inmates that I talked to were quite open. In fact, they were proud of what they had been shot with, and would just be open books for me. So I learned a lot about gunshot wounds and things like that, and stab wounds, and you can keep functioning amazingly well after you've been shot or stabbed, at least for a limited time.
Yeah.
The biggest thing about, I'm sorry?
You're familiar with the Florida FBI shootout, right?
Yes.
Which brought the 40 S&W into play for a number of years. Okay, so for my students, there was a FBI shootout with a gentleman who was heavily drugged up. I believe it was a combination of, I believe it was cocaine, it may have been meth.
I think so.
Guys on stupid amounts of stimulants. And I think the FBI shot him something like 37 times. And the guy was legally dead and yet was still able to kill like 2 or 3 other officers before he finally stopped moving, running, and expired.
And they blamed it all on the 9mm being too weak of a round.
And I don't know. What's your opinion on that? Was it the 9mm too weak a round? Do you think it was a piss poor 9mm ammunition, or do you think it was just crappy shot placement?
I don't think it was actually any of those. The shot placement was good. It had, as I understand it, actually got to his heart. There was some decent shot placement. It just, if somebody doesn't want to die, they're not going to die unless you do 2 things. You hit the central nervous system, the brain, spinal column, whatever, or blow the heart out so the blood pressure goes to 0. But with the blood pressure thing, you still have enough oxygen to go about 10 to 15 seconds. I saw a video of a guy robbing a bank. He was shot through the heart, blew his heart out. I mean, it was gone. There wasn't anything left. He was so impressed that he ran out the door and ran half a block down the street before he collapsed and died. So even if you take somebody's heart out, it depends what's going on up here.
Yeah.
That adrenaline and stuff, you don't know what's going to happen. They can keep functioning. I have a friend, actually, George Mathias. He's on the USN. You know him.
Yeah, Murkoff.
Yeah, Murkoff. He was involved in a shooting where they shot the guy, I don't know how many times, with pistol rounds. It wasn't doing anything. And in the end, the guy was armed with it was a BB pistol, but they didn't know it at the time. They thought it was real. Murkoff had to shoot him 4 times with a 12 gauge to put the guy down. 4 rounds of double-aught buck before the guy actually went down, which my head tells me that's totally impossible. You can't absorb that much, but he did anyway.
I'm going to pause it real quick here, Jim. I need to go check on something. So let's for about 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, so 1. Okay. All right, so Jim, what about firearms? Did you encounter firearms aside from what the guards had in the prison system at any level?
Yeah, not really personally firearms, but sometimes we'd find ammunition out in the main yard or in areas in the prison. So the inmates were getting ammunition in there, and it's not very difficult to make a homemade gun. I mean, they've got all the time in the world. So
yeah.
On one occasion back in, I think it was 1983, before I worked there, the inmates managed to smuggle in a couple Remington 870 12-gauge shotguns along with some pistols. And it was an escape attempt, and they tried to get out via one of the guard towers. They have like lights on the top of the tower. The inmates threw a rope up and they lassoed the light and were climbing. At the time, they were short-staffed. The staff was, so they were manning every other tower.
Wow.
What happened was daylight saving time hit and they reversed the rotation. So that tower was supposed to be unmanned, but it turned out it was manned because of the rotation switch. So the inmates were climbing up a manned guard tower. They got, the guard came out, and of course, there was a brief firefight. The inmates fell back into the main kitchen area, took hostages, staff and inmates. They took hostages. And it was like a week-long hostage siege there.
Yeah,
So
this is one of the more prison standoffs, if I remember correctly, isn't it?
yeah, it's pretty notorious. It's closed now, but
Yeah.
yeah, there were some other instances where we suspect weapons were found, but they always covered everything up. Everything was always downplayed by management. We saw state police. They searched the chapel and the Muslim mosque, which was in the basement level of the chapel, and the state police were bringing out very long boxes, the exact kind of boxes you would find in a gun store.
The kind you package.
They wouldn't show us what was inside the boxes. They took them out. Prior to that, we had found drugs, money, and other weapons down there that they had no problem showing us. But these boxes were taken right out the door, and nobody got to see what was in them. We asked, but they were like, "Don't worry about it."
Yeah, I think I will worry about it. Thanks.
So when you tell me don't worry about it, that's when I worry about it.
Did you
Yeah.
ever encounter any bombs or explosives in the prison system of inmates getting that creative and going old anarchist book?
Not really. They had made some gasoline bombs in the past, and there was somebody got cooked in a cell. I guess they firebombed his cell. I wasn't there for that one, but they would do things like setting their mattress on fire, stuff in their cell they would set on fire, which would cause a havoc because it's an enclosed environment. So then you have to activate the fire team. So yeah, there was a lot of fires. That was one of the things they like to do, just to basically make chaos. They would set stuff on fire.
Okay. What about unexplained deaths or stuff that you're like, we have no idea what happened. This guy is just dead. Did you see very many like natural deaths or unexplained deaths?
There was a lot of natural deaths because you were dealing with 4,000 plus inmates.
Okay.
So somebody was always dying of natural causes. One of the weirdest ones, it was disgusting. A guy had a brain tumor, and he was on my caseload, and they were trying to parole the guy, but he wasn't interested in paroling, and the tumor kept growing in his head, and it actually pushed his eye out of the socket. And I didn't see that in person, but my one friend said, "Here's a cool email. Look at this photo." And I opened up the photo, and it's of the eye hanging out of his socket on the guy's, basically his cheek.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, thanks for that. I still have that image in my head, and that was probably 15 years ago.
Yeah, I had a parafriend send me I guess a HIPAA acceptable image from a accident. Apparently there was a gentleman who was consuming large amounts of malt liquor while trying to mow his lawn.
Oh,
And apparently
no good can come of that.
no. And so yeah, I got to see what the inside of a tibia looked like.
Ah,
Yeah.
yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, great stuff. Really, you think you could have given me a little bit of warning and been like, "Hey, check out what I saw on the scene today." I'm like,
yeah, you just open it up and it's like, oh wow, okay.
at least Instagram gives me a little bit of warning in advance.
Yeah. Well, in that vein too, it's worth mentioning. I used to be able to look at all that stuff and laugh about it. I mean, I've been on the scene with untold amounts of gore, and it never bothered me. But at some point, I got to the point where I couldn't look at blood anymore. Even fake, cheesy looking crime scenes on television that you're like, yeah, that looks so stupid, it's unreal. Even that stuff started to freak me out. And basically, I was told that I had reached my saturation point. So now it's not as bad now. It's kind of, it kind of has faded, but I still don't really care to look at stuff like that.
Yeah, my dad, who's retired white collar, and my stepmom, who's retired violent offender, they think they think NCIS is the funniest show in the world because they'll be like, "That's not how it works. You have to get a warrant for that, and a warrant for that, and a warrant for that."
Speaking of warrants, we actually had an inmate. His name is William Bradfield. I might have mentioned him in the previous video. Joseph Wambaugh wrote a book about it, Echoes in the Darkness. It was Upper Marion, Pennsylvania school teacher. Him and the principal were implicated in the murder of one of the teachers and their children, the lady's two kids.
Yeah.
When he never divulged where the children ended up, he dissolved her body in a vat of acid in his basement. When they conducted a search on his home, they found it hadn't quite done away with her remains yet. The children they never found. When he passed away, he had a heart attack. They actually taped off his cell, and the FBI came in to investigate. It was a crime scene. They investigated. They were trying to find some shred of evidence as far as what happened to the children, but they never did. But that was kind of one of the weirder things after a death, that they actually, they got a search warrant for the cell. Yeah, it was so.
Okay, so but the person's deceased. Do you need to have a search warrant if someone's deceased?
I suspect they wanted to just preserve the chain of evidence.
Just keep it up and up.
They didn't want an attorney to come back later on and say, well, you guys just barged in on this guy's belongings or whatever. The legalities are really bizarre in prison. Some things you don't need probable cause. You can just have reasonable suspicion and search a guy or do anything. And other times they take it to the nth degree the opposite way. So it was kind of weird, the legal system, how it operated.
Okay. So we've talked about homicide or people basically purposely attacking each other.
Oh, if I could I jump in with one really bizarre story? There was a couple instances where the inmates, I think they strangled this guy to death, and they wanted to conceal his death from us. So over the course of 2 or 3 days, they would go into his cell. They would move him around the cell and put him in different poses. Like in one pose, he was sitting on his bed with the remote in his hand watching television. In another, he was on the toilet going to the bathroom.
So basically, he did Bernie a murder in a prison cell.
Yeah. They staged him in different poses. So we'd walk by and go, oh, he's in there. He's okay. And just sitting watching television. That was kind of weird. Another one, they killed a guy on one cell block. They threw his body in a laundry cart because, in prison, they have to do these mass quantities of laundry. So they threw him in the bottom of that. They threw all the laundry bags on top of him. So he was in the bottom. And the carts are like 3.5, 4 feet tall. So you're not going to tear all these bags out all the time to search because, again, it's inconvenient.
Yeah.
So, they transported him to another cell block. Of course, we found the body eventually, but because you do count like 7 times a day. So it's kind of like, all right, where's this guy at? Things aren't adding up. But, sometimes they just do it to screw with us. So it's just a couple of bizarre.
Let's kill somebody.
Yeah, let's kill him, and then we'll see how long we can keep it from the guards. The thing is, there's not always a legitimate purpose to what they do. Sometimes they just do it to we call it getting over on the system, just to get over. They'll steal something out of the chow hall, and you'll see them throw it in the garbage on the way out. They stole it just to see if they could steal it.
Yeah.
Just to get over on the system, and then they're like, all right, well, I'm not going to eat it. I'll just throw it away.
Wow.
So they just do stuff to get over.
Okay. All right. So kind of let's wrap this up. We've talked about violent murders or violent cause of death, which you said the most common you saw is the shanking or the stabbing. So not pull out my knife, not a slicing, but a, overhand ice pick grip.
Emily.
Yep. And I just dropped my butterfly knife.
On your foot?
Yeah. On my leg. I'm like, yeah, it's not bad. Okay, we talked about, I'm a quality educator right now. We've talked about suicide, indecent amount of suicide. Now, accidental death, you said we don't see it. We talked about the one accidental death you saw, but accidental deaths are not super common.
Not really.
And then we talked about natural deaths, and natural deaths would be everything from a tumor to a heart attack to a stroke to old age to untreated disease and everything in between.
And we used to joke that stabbings were natural causes because they sort of are in there.
Yeah, I mean, that many people under that kind of constrained situation for that long a period of time, I imagine there's going to be, some emotional output needed, sometimes in a violent manner.
Yeah.
So, and then, did you ever have deaths where you're like, we have no idea what happened?
Not really. No, they pretty much would sift out what happened. And maybe if it was a suicide, we would, we'd figure it out. The weirdest suicide I saw was a guy who he hung himself, but before he did that, he stuffed his mouth and throat with so much toilet paper, and then he hung himself. And they came in and cut him down, and this was sick, but I had just became a counselor, so my unit manager and we were friends. So we walked down to the cell, and the guy's laying out on the cell block, and he's got all this toilet paper. It's all over the floor. It's coming out of his mouth, and we're like, "What the hell?" I guess he didn't want to cry out or something. I don't know.
He was definitely out to survive.
Yeah, he just jammed his mouth and throat with the toilet paper, and we're talking, and this was my demented sense of humor, but I looked at my buddy, the unit manager. I said, "Jeff, does this mean we're going to lunch late?" And so we're talking, and I'm just, we're so nonchalant that we're talking, and I'm standing there, and next thing I knew, I stepped on something squishy, and I looked over, and it was the toilet paper coming out of the guy's mouth, and I'm like, "Oh, okay." I'm like, "All right, well, maybe we should go now."
Yeah, awesome. Well, that definitely falls under the weird category. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this up for right now, but we're going to go ahead, and part of the assignment for my students is they're going to ask questions. I'm going to ask every student once they finish watching this to not only kind of answer the questions that for the things that are going on in here, but to also ask some questions. And so next time we talk to you, Jim, we're going to have some, hopefully about 25 student questions to ask.
Okay.
About everything prison related. And I'm going to try to get them to focus on violent crime, but sometimes they just want to know, how much does it cost for some sweet loving in the prison if, using the conversion rate of ramen and stamps.
Okay.
But thank you so much for your time, Jim. I'm
Always a pleasure.
And whoops, let me hold up here, and we're going to go and stop recording.